Good day to everybody out there. Good day to everybody out there. What's going on? What's good on the internet? What's good on YouTube? What's good in sports? What's good in life? Name's Akiem Balaam. I know it's been a little bit since I recorded my return video on my page, but I've just been dealing with a lot, but I'm really trying to get a lot more consistent, of course, with the content and everything. So I'm definitely going to start doing that real soon. So thanks everybody out there for bearing with me. Okay, so to the subject of this here video. So for those that don't know, particularly New Yorkers, so apparently, 98.7 FM. I'm a big radio buff, so I'm going to be talking a lot of radio on my channel. So 98.7 FM has been where ESPN Radio has pretty much been parked for the last decade or so. I guess the last decade or so. So that's where ESPN has been as of late. And it looks like that ESPN is actually about to move off of 98.7. They're about to move off and they're about to become exclusively back to 1050 AM once again. So there's a bit of a backstory to this according to the reports that have come out. So for those that know or don't know, 98.7 for such a long time used to be 98.7 KISS FM, used to be one of two R&B stations in the New York City market, along with, of course, WBLS. A lot of that KISS audience in 2012, of course, moved over to WBLS once the station had changed formats. And there was a bit of a story behind that as well. When they changed formats, it's still owned by MS, which was the owners of the station when it was KISS FM. But even though MS technically still owns the station, they pretty much leased the station out to ESPN. It's called an LMA in radio terms. And when the LMA took place, that's when ESPN went over to FM. It was during a period of time when there were lots of AM exclusive sports stations that were moving over to the FM band. That became a huge thing. So they went to 98.7. Eventually, a few years later, their main competitors at WFAN, they also moved over and got onto the 101.9 frequency. So when ESPN had moved over to 98.7, that was supposed to be the thing that was supposed to give them a bit of a leg up on WFAN, because at the time WFAN was only on 660 at the time, and then of course eventually they moved to 101.9, which evened the score in a lot of ways. So now a few years, some years later, now we're at a point where essentially ESPN, outside of their national ESPN Radio, they all but got out of the radio business entirely. Disney has been getting out of the radio business to a certain extent. Of course, Radio Disney is no longer around. And then they started selling off a lot of their local ESPN radio stations that were owned and operated. I remember once upon a time, ESPN used to have 6 owned and operated radio stations. They had one in New York, they had one in LA, they had one in Chicago, they had one in Dallas, and they had one in Pittsburgh. I forgot what happened to the one at Pittsburgh at 12:50 a.m. I think the one in Dallas was sold off to a religious broadcaster. So that leaves New York, LA, Chicago. So those 3 stations, if I remember correctly, were all acquired by a company out of Wisconsin called Good Karma Broadcasting. Karmazin, for those that don't know. So Good Karma Broadcasting, they, got the stations, including the LMA of ESPN 98.7. Well, apparently, according to reports that were released a few weeks ago or about a month ago, that LMA, it looks like, is about to expire. It's about to run out sometime in August of 2024, and they have no intention on renewing it. So it's about to go completely back over to MS. So the question is, what happens to ESPN 98.7? Immediately, my fears started peaking up about this possibility, and I started thinking, okay, this station is about to be sold off to another one of these religious broadcasters, like maybe Educational Media Foundation, K-Love Air One. I mean, K-Love and Air One, they've bought so many channels over the years. And of course, they have 2 networks where they can put their programming on, not just K-Love, but also Air One. But they have so many channels they have so many radio stations that they have bought over the years. They bought 98.7. They bought 97.9 out of Chicago, the former Loop. They bought WPLJ 95.5. They bought 107.3, the former WAAF in Boston. They have brought so many radio stations. It's really made folks really start to look at them some sort of way. So is that a possibility? Well, according to a piece that was written on Radio Insight, the purchase price probably for a 98.7 in New York is probably going to be so steep, it may essentially price those religious broadcasters out of the running. So maybe we don't necessarily have to worry about that. It also mentioned the possibility, of course, only speculation now. We don't know anything about who the prospective buyers are going to be and probably won't for some time. But there is a possibility that maybe Radio One, because they've been trying to expand their radio properties. They just did so in Houston by buying out a few stations from Cox. Could it be a possibility that maybe Radio One, which is known for owning a bunch of black stations, do they get into the running and possibly buy 98.7 to return 98.7 KISS to the New York City airwaves? Who knows? Is all a possibility at this point. So we'll see definitely what happens. And reports have also mentioned as far as what could potentially happen with their sports properties. Because of course, they are the flagship station of the Knicks and Rangers, both MSG teams, as well as the New York Jets. And there may be something that could very well go on with the New York Jets. Now, if the New York Jets end up changing flagships, Odyssey is pretty much full over at WFAN, so who are they going to change flagships to? There's a report that mentions iHeart, possibly putting them over on 104.3, Q104.3. So there's a lot that could potentially happen with all of this. But I think this is going to be one of the more fascinating stories, because what was interesting about this is how it mentioned in the New York Post report that was written by Andrew Marchand about how a big part of the reason as to why this is happening with 98.7 and why they're going over to the 1050 AM frequency exclusively once again is because supposedly they've been having more success with their podcasts more so than they have with the 98.7 frequency. And I think that is very fascinating, because I really would like to know if other FM sports stations are also undergoing this same phenomenon, where they're on an FM frequency, but they're having more success getting folks to listen to their podcasts more so than they are with people listening to the actual frequency. So if that's the case, and if that's something that is being duplicated at other FM stations, could it be a situation where maybe other FM sports stations are looking at their FM frequencies and they're thinking, you know what, maybe we don't need these FMs. Maybe we could go back to AM. Maybe these FM stations could possibly be bought out by somebody, possibly somebody to put a music format or something on there. And maybe, just maybe, we need to do a better job at plugging our podcast stream. The only downside to that, of course, is how it's going to tick off the teams that have their flagships with their stations. So it's a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting and fascinating radio topic where they're balancing out the data that could very well be showing that maybe they're getting more success out of their podcasts, but also the teams are thinking, hey, we signed up with these stations to be on FM. We didn't sign up, obviously, for the podcast stuff. The podcast is one thing, but we signed up primarily for the FM frequency. So how are the teams going to navigate this, especially if it's a situation that's being duplicated at other stations, at other FM stations that happen to have sports flagships? I mean, think about it like this. The Minnesota Timberwolves and the Lynx, they recently did a deal where the Timberwolves games will be broadcast on iHeart and the Lynx games will be broadcast on KFAN 1130 up in Minnesota. So teams are trying to find innovative ways to sort of get out of the radio bubble, the radio exclusive bubble that they've been in for such a long time. And they're trying to put more emphasis on the actual audio element of everything. I mean, that's what radio is calling itself more or less nowadays. It's calling itself more audio, more so than it's even calling itself radio. So I think it's a fascinating thing to follow. I think it's a fascinating thing to follow, particularly when you look at the long-term ramifications of just everything going on with 98.7, everything going on with sports radio in general. And who knows? It could very well be a shift. I mean, think about it like this. In Chicago, 670 The Score never went to FM. ESPN 1000 never went to FM, and both stations are still doing pretty well. You have all these stations that have gone over to FM, but it seems as though Chicago, other than a brief stint where you had an 87.7 former low-power TV6 Franken FM that used to be a sports station, but other than that, and I think the station was owned by Tribune at the time, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but yeah, you haven't really seen, at least in Chicago, too many stations on the sports side really go to FM, but we see it just about every place else. So I think that this is very fascinating, and I'm really interested to see how this is going to shake out in terms of the flagships and how this is going to shake out as well in terms of just the overall sports radio industry. I mean, could we be seeing more of these sports radio stations potentially go back over to AM exclusively, especially if they're getting the data that perhaps maybe that Good Karma has about ESPN 98.7? We'll see. Only time will tell. So just wanted to get on here and just chat a little bit about that. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about 98.7 possibly going music again? How do you feel about ESPN 1050 becoming ESPN 1050 again? How do you feel about this? And just how do you feel about sports radio in general? Rate, comment, react, reply as always. Add and subscribe. So until next time, thanks once again for checking out another one of my vids. I'm Akiem Balaam signing off. See you on the internet someplace.